Okay, we're live again. This time we're doing Vedic wisdom. Wisdom of the Vedas series. And for today's topic, let's talk about reincarnation. Okay, so let's see what the Vedas have to say about reincarnation. Now, the easiest way to discuss the Vedas at all is to study Bhagavad Gita. Why is that? So real quick, let me just explain why this is. The history of the Veda is that it developed over many, many generations or centuries, and then people or a person named Vyas wanted to consolidate it because it was so spread out. There were so many books written on so many different subjects with apparently so many varying opinions. So Vyas set out to consolidate it, and the second effort, he made 3 efforts to consolidate it. The first was the Vedanta Sutra, but he felt that was too difficult for people to understand. So his second attempt was Mahabharata, and in the key section of Mahabharata is Gita. Gita is a chapter in Mahabharata. So really what he's doing with Gita is trying to summarize and consolidate everything that's explained throughout the whole Vedas. The third effort that he made, which he was most satisfied with, was a Purana called Bhagavatam, but that's very long. So for quick explanations like what we're doing here, Gita is a really handy resource. So let's talk about what the Gita has to say about reincarnation, how it describes it, and that's a summary of what all the Vedas are teaching about it, all the Upanishads and so on. Okay? Alrighty. So let me get my chat window up here. Okay, so what I want to I'll start off with this point. There's a second chapter really talks about this, because second chapter is really early in the book and it gives you the basic stuff like life and death. So second chapter is kind of one of the first things that Krishna even says in the whole Gita is "Nat tvevaham jatu nasham natvam neme janadipa na chaiva na bhavishyama sarve vayam ataparam." So the first thing that he says is, I don't have a beginning or an end, and you don't have a beginning or an end. And all these people around us don't have a beginning or an end. We are us, now, in the past, and in the future forevermore. That's really the translation of what he just said. So do you remember last week, if you were here for last week's class, we talked about creation, right? And the main point that I wanted to make on the topic of creation is there isn't a creation. There isn't a creation in the sense of things having a point where they began. What the Vedas actually teach about creation is that things are beginningless. Things are the way they are, and that's the way they are. Things are beginningless, but they just transform or change states. So what we're going to do today is just see how that applies not to the cosmos, but how it applies to you as an individual. You also don't have a creation date or an expiration date. So that's the first thing that he says in the Gita. Krishna says, I don't have a creation date, and I don't have an expiration date, and neither do you, and neither does anybody. So it's basically like as above, so below, right? The same way the cosmos is, so are all the individuals. So you understand that? You don't have a creation. You have to stop thinking of yourself as though you have a point on a timeline where you begin. Okay, there's questions coming up, like how do you get over past lives? Why don't you have memories of past lives? I'll deal with those questions too, but let me first give you the basic explanation of what this whole thing is. So the next thing that Krishna says, right after he says that, is even though you don't have a beginning point or an end point, you go through various changes all the time. And those changes have beginnings and ends. And so the next thing that he says is, Dehinasmin yata dehe komaram yovanam jara, tata dehantara prapti dhirastatranamuyate. You don't have a beginning and an end point, but you're constantly going through youth, childhood, middle age, old age, death, birth, youth, childhood, middle age, old age, death, birth. So what you want to do here to understand what he's talking about is, remember in the first class we talked about Prakriti and Purusha? There's the two components of reality in the cosmos. It's the same thing in you. There's two components to you. At least two. We can categorize it into two. There's the observer and there's the observed. The Purusha is the observer and the Prakriti is the observed. Right? So the changes, just like in the universe, the changes always happen in the things that we observe, but not in the observer. If the observer were to change, then it wouldn't remember, it wouldn't be able to notice changes in the thing that it observes. The reason why we can know that we're getting older is because we're the same being that we were when we were younger. If we actually just changed along with all the changes, then we wouldn't know that there was something different before. Like, if you're born in 1970, then you don't, and let's say there's no media, no history, anything, no newspapers, you don't know what it was like in 1960. So you don't know that there was a change between the 60s and the 70s when you're born in the 70s. But if you're born in the 50s, you know there was a change between the 50s to the 60s and the 60s and the 70s. So if you change along with the things that you're observing, then you wouldn't know that there's any change. It's only because you're constant, you're not changing, that you can observe changes. So what Krishna is basically saying is, whether it's the universe or whether it's your individual life, there's always changes going on. Beginning, you're aging, you're being born, you're dying, you're aging. The changes are constantly going on, but the changes are going on in the thing that you're observing. It's not going on in the observer. You understand? That's a really great concept. This will actually give you the ability to actually get tons of mental health. If you can grasp this concept, if you can realize that the changes, which are sometimes so full of anxiety, that are all the changes that are happening to us are happening in the things that we observe, but we're the observer. So they are only touching us insofar as we allow them to, by our investment into the observation that we're making. The more emotionally invested you get into the observation that you make, that's the more thrilled or dismayed you'll be by what you're observing. Isn't it? If you're not into a movie very much and then the main character is dying and crying, you don't care. But if you get really, really into the movie that you're watching, then when the main character has a little bit of a change of luck, then you feel it very strongly, right? So it's the amount that the observer invests herself or himself into the observation that the changes in the observed stuff seems to affect the observer. Get it? So, all right, let's see. So any questions about this stuff so far? Yeah, question of if the creation consciousness stemmed from Christianity. No, it's much older than Christianity. But it is popularized these days by Christianity because Christianity is so prevalent. The idea that things are created. No, in ancient India, there's Charvaka school, which has the idea that things are created. Just a very old concept. It's just not a Vedic one. Let me see what this one is. Yeah, I'm gonna handle this like, how do you deal with past lives? Why don't you remember past lives? All that after I explain what reincarnation is. So don't forget that both the observer and the observed are both transcendental. All right, so let's go on. So now think about this. If you are forever, if you have no beginning and you have no end, reincarnation is the only possible possibility, isn't it? Unless you get it totally right. So go back if you can to last week where we talked about creation. Remember what we said? What is the thing that has no beginning or end? What is the observer? The observer is the raw consciousness itself. See, the problem is, the reason why it's very difficult for us to separate the observer from the observation is that we mistake the tools of observation for the observer. We use the consciousness has the capacity to experience things, but not the tools. So consciousness has to manifest within Prakriti some tools. Prakriti provides Purusha, the consciousness, Prakriti, or what you could say like material, provides the spirit with what it needs to be able to actualize its potential. So the conscious core of what we are has the ability to perceive things, but it doesn't have any tools or any objects to perceive. So Prakriti provides both the tools of observation and the objects that are observed. Now, it's pretty easy for us to see that we are not the objects that we observe, that the objects change. For a couple of years, I have this MacBook computer. For another couple of years, I have an iMac. For a couple of different computers, things are changing. It's not me. Sometimes I'm in this house, sometimes I'm in that house, right? That's easy. But it's harder and more important for us to realize that the tools that we use are also a manifestation of Prakriti, and they will also change. Tools are like your eyes, your ears, your nose, your mouth. Right? So we can have changes in the tools as well. And one of the tools for observation is your mind. This is very interesting. One of the tools for the mind is also a tool for observation, which also changes all the time. So even more than realizing that you're not your hands, or you're not your eyes, or you're not your skin, it's even more advanced or empowering to realize that you're not even the mind, which is utilizing the immediate, like the super tool that coordinates and uses all the other tools. The mind is the thing that experiences happiness, distress, and so forth. And we observe it happening in the mind. So it's not just the world that's changing all the time. It's actually the way that you manifest yourself. Now, what consciousness wants to do is experience things, right? That's the whole reason why there's creation, because consciousness wants to experience things. Thank you, Sonia. So that's what consciousness wants to do. It wants to experience things, so it manifests tools and objects to observe. But we experience reincarnation because we are bits of consciousness that haven't really figured out who we really are yet. So we're experiencing reincarnation because we're looking. It's like shopping. We're looking for the right shoe. And we're trying a whole bunch of different shoes on. So, Prakriti Sthani Kashti, Mana Sashtendriyasyani, Prakriti Sthani Kashani. Krishna said that in chapter 13. He says that consciousness goes into Prakriti and then pulls different kinds of shoes off the shelf. Prakriti Sthani Kashani. It pulls different manas, different minds and indriyas, tools, senses from Prakriti, pulls them together in different ways to experience the world in different ways. Looking for the thing that it is, looking for the experience that it wants. And then experiencing always an undercurrent of dissatisfaction, which is always why it wants things to change. So actually life and death is the opportunity that's built into the material world for us to shop and try different things on. So we try different approaches to life and every different life. All right. Make sense so far? So good. So now here you also have to think about simple things. So actually Arjuna says, okay, that's great. So Krishna says, you have no beginning or end, but the thing that you observe, which includes your body and your mind, is nothing but beginnings and endings because it's constantly changing. So don't worry too much. So the third thing that he says, the very next thing that he says is Matra Sparshas tu Kaunteya Shitoshna Sukha Dukkada Agama Paina Nityas Tang Titikshasva Bharata. Just don't get so disturbed. Titikshava, become more like calm. Don't get so disturbed by the heat and cold and happiness and distress that comes in the mind and the body and the world. Because it's just coming and going like Sita and Ushna, like summer and winter. It's going to come and go. So just don't get so tossed around by the comings and goings of it. Be calm. It's not you. It's a really nice sequence of things that Krishna says right in the beginning of the Gita. The first things that he says. Actually, the first thing he says is a little bit of a smack to Arjuna. The first thing he says is, well, you're acting kind of silly. And then the second thing he says is, and then he starts with this, none of us, we don't have any beginnings or endings, but the things which we observe are full of beginnings and endings. And then the third thing that he says is, so don't get so carried away by the changes in the things that you observe. So then, at a certain point, a little bit later in chapter 2, when Arjuna gets a chance to kind of respond to Krishna, one of the things that he says is, well, that's all well and good if there's such a thing as the soul. Right? But what if there's not? So Krishna has an interesting version of explaining that. So at that point, Krishna says, look, some people say that there's a soul. First of all, he says this statement like Ascharyavat Pashyati Kaschidenam, that there's tons of different opinions on this topic of whether there's a soul or not, because it's so difficult to understand it. And even if somebody understands the topic, it's extremely difficult to explain it to somebody else. So then he says, so here's some of the key different points of view. He says, one of the points of view, which is the one as presented in the Vedas, is that you are a beginningless, endless entity, right? You're a beginningless, endless entity, but you observe changes, and even changes in your body. So going back to that earlier statement that he made, like, Dehina asmin yata dehe komaram yovaram jara. Just like you're observing changes from youth, just like you observe a change from youth to middle age to old age, tata, just like that, dehantara, when you get to the end of old age, when you die, prapti, you get a new one. You get a new life, a new body. Dhiras tatra namuyate. It's not that confusing for somebody that thinks about it calmly, Krishna says. Just like you're changing the body all the time, your body's constantly changing, so it's not that confusing to comprehend that it's going to just change in a different way, in a bigger way when it gets to the end. So, the Vedic concept is that there's a constant observer, and the things that the things that are observed are constantly changing. But then Arjuna says, well, what if there's not a constant observer? And then Krishna says, well, then you still have no problem. And he says this pretty amazing thing. I can't remember the Sanskrit to this one. Avyakta madhyadini, something like this. He says that everything is, if you think that there's no constant observer, then you think that actually everything is originally nothing. Right? So this is a very old book. So this idea was present for a very long time, which you have in modern science, which is that things come out of nothing. Or Buddhism has this idea as well. Things come out of nothing. And then they exist for a while, and they go back into nothing. You're nothing, really. You're just here for a little while, and then when you die, you're nothing again. So Krishna says, let's say that's true. Then in the beginning, you're nothing. All right? Then in the middle, you're something, and then at the end, you're nothing. So he says, if something comes from nothing, and then that something becomes nothing again, then it's going to become something again. So do you get this? He says, if something comes from nothing, if nothing, you never existed, but then all of a sudden you existed, then after death you don't exist anymore, you're nothing again. That means you're going to exist again. Because that's the state that you went to. Square one is 0. Square 2 is 1. Then if square 3 is 0, then square 3 equals square 1, right? So if square 3 equals square 1, then it's going to behave in the same way as square 1 does, which is go to square 2, which is 1. You get it? So if nothing becomes something and then becomes nothing again, then certainly it's going to become something again. Because that's what nothing does. Nothing becomes something. And then if something becomes nothing, then it comes back into something. Do you get this? This is really cool because this means no matter whether you're a theist or an atheist, reincarnation is the only logical way to look at the world. If you're a theist or a soulist and you feel that there's a constant underlying consciousness in you and in the universe, then reincarnation is the only reasonable way to look at things because that constant underlying consciousness is constantly manifesting different forms. Fine. If you're not a theist or not a soulist or don't think that there's any constant underlying force that things just popped out of nothing, then reincarnation is still the only reasonable way to look at things. Because if nothing becomes something and then goes back to being nothing, then what's going to stop it from becoming something again? So no matter what thing you believe in, whether you have a basically theistic worldview or a basically atheistic worldview, reincarnation is the only way to make sense of what's actually going on in the world. Then after saying this, Arjuna says, well, which one is right? And Krishna says, well, my opinion is that there's an unchanging underlying conscious reality. And that, I'm just saying, even if there is no such thing as a soul, and it's all just matter popping out of nothing, then when the matter pops back into nothing, then certainly it's going to do the same thing again and pop back out later. You get it? I think now at this point, let's see what some of these questions are. They're good questions. Okay, these are great questions. So I think it's pretty much time for questions. So what is reincarnation? Reincarnation is simply the fact that consciousness always produces forms. Really, that's what it is. Reincarnation is simply the fact that consciousness always produces forms, and if it produces a form that it's not fully satisfied with, then it's going to change that form. Now, you also have to put in the equation of karma, and maybe karma will be the topic for next week, what karma really is. So it modifies karma modifies certain things. But basically, this is the basic idea. Consciousness produces form, and if it produces a form that it doesn't like, then it's testing the forms. If consciousness doesn't really know what form it wants to produce, then it's testing forms. And as it tests forms, it lets them start and expire, so then change to another one. Okay, yeah, and we'll have Maya as one of the topics too. All right, so this is what I'm going to do now. I'm going to take the questions in the order that I got them. So I think the first question was, why don't we remember past lives? The second question is, what if you do remember a past life? How do you get over it? Some kind of past life connection. And interesting questions. All right, so let's start with this one. Why don't you remember past lives? You remember what you want to remember. You remember what facilitates your goals. That's what you remember, whether it's in this life or past lives. And you do remember things from past lives, but you may not necessarily know that they're from past lives. There's a big reason why you don't remember past lives, and it's because you remember what you want to remember. So if you actually remembered past lives, your ability to sync your consciousness into this one would be vastly, vastly, vastly diminished. Right? So in other words, right now we're really invested in this world that we're in right now. We're really invested in it. It makes a big deal to us. Everything's a big deal, from the way people treat us to the way we feed ourselves to the way our bodies look. Everything's a big deal to us, and it's real important to us. Can you imagine if all of a sudden you just realize that none of that makes any difference? You would be lost. You'd be lost. And you would not really know what to do, who you are, what to do. So it's because of the fact that we're so invested in this thing that we are right now that we actually, the subconscious blocks memories which would remind us that we're not. That's one reason. Another reason why you don't remember past lives explicitly, what you actually do constantly remember from past lives is the impact of them. That's how karma transmits from one life to another. So, but the reason why you don't remember the specifics is because memories have to be triggered. Memories have to be triggered in the present. Otherwise, they move to the back of the hard disk space and eventually get removed to make space for new ones. So, because they are deemed by the Mercury process to be irrelevant. So, because we change, like for example, when you move from one house to the next, the memories from that house that you were previously in will start to dwindle because you don't see the same rooms where those things happened. So when you move from one body to the next, your memories from the previous one dwindle rapidly because there's no more stimulus is reminding you of the specifics of what happened in that life. But although you don't remember the specifics, all of the essence of what happened in the past life makes you who and what you are right now. Okay, so that's why you don't remember past lives. You can remember past lives if you really want to, and if you also, and some people do. Sometimes you get past lives and memories and dreams. Sometimes you'll just get flashes of them. Sometimes the most easiest reliable way to figure out what your past lives were primarily involved in. Narada says this in Bhagavatam, because somebody asked a question, how can you know your past life? And Narada, the sage Narada, explains the easiest way to do it is to just see what things you know in this life that you didn't need to learn. The things that you know that you didn't need to really learn, that were so easy for you to pick up, are the things that you were involved with directly in very recent past lives. So for example, like if a girl is like 6 years old and sits down at the piano and starts going, she was playing musical instruments in her past lives. All right, now the other question is, what if you do recognize that you have like a past life, a connection with something from a past life? The thing that you have to really remember is past life is just a longer version of this life. Everything is changing. Your past life is gone. So sometimes we think it's such a big deal. Wow, I was doing this in my past life. And now, or I was with this person in my past life. And now in this lifetime, I met that person again. Wow, oh my God, this is so special. It's not that special. It's not that special when you realize that you've been around forever. There's nobody that you're not a past life mate with. It might not be so close that you actually remember it. There's nothing that you haven't done. There's no subject you haven't mastered. It's just that the ones that you feel like, whoa, I remember this from a past life. It's just one of these recent past lives. So I mean, what you really, and Krishna does this in chapter 8. He talks about this in chapter 8 of Gita. He goes into this elaborate thing about how long the universe exists. All just for the purpose to, like, how many times you can live in this and that, and all these lengths of times, and this enormous lengths of times, and then at the end, the whole reason for him to say the whole thing is just to say, you know what? No matter how big the number is, of how many years it lasts, it all equals 0 next to infinity. You're an infinite being. So it doesn't matter how many times you've been in contact with something in the past life. It all is not that relevant. So really the thing to do is not get hung up on what you were doing in your past life, but get hung up on figuring out what form you really want to manifest what does your consciousness really want to be? And try to manifest that. Don't get caught up on trying to replicate something from a past life or stick with it again or something like that. I hope that helps. Yeah, there's techniques to remember past lives. There's people who have the whole careers on that. And actually, I went to one. I'll tell you a funny story. This was a guy in, gosh, I wish I could remember his name. I think his name is Damodar, in England. And the band that I was in was touring over there. And then we stayed at his house. And his profession was mass hypnosis for past life regression. So there was 5 of us traveling, 4 band members and 1 helper. And so we said, well, can you do this on us? So he took us into this room and we all like lay down on like these lazy boy chairs. And he did his hypnosis thing. And this will also tell you the nature of like Saturn in Kritika in the 5th house, which is my chart. Saturn and Kritika in the 5th house, which is the house of intelligence, and Kritika is very sharp and Saturn is very analytical. It's not an easy person to hypnotize. So he's doing all this stuff and I'm following along, and all of a sudden I look around and I notice that all 4 of my friends are out. They're out, but I was still like fully not hypnotized. And then he's just talking to them, and then they all start seeing memories. And then they start talking about them in like some semi-lucid state. So it was very interesting how a couple of us were involved in the same memories. Like some people were having memories of me in their past life, but I couldn't get anything because I didn't get hypnotized. But then at another time in my life, I had dreams, which were things that I could not, which were experiences that are totally foreign to me. And so I had some past memories come through that way. So sometimes they can pop through in dreams, or some people are good at doing it through hypnosis. All right. So, oh, I know the funniest part about this whole story was that the drummer in this band was such a sloth. They would always sleep all day long. So much so that, like, sometimes we would lose him at like a rest stop or something because we would just think he was sleeping in his bunk. But actually, he had left the bus without telling anybody. So then, so the funniest thing about this whole reincarnation session was that he was like, oh, there's sand under my feet and the water is cold, but it feels good. Wow, I have a lot of hair. Or something. I was like, and then he like snaps out of it. He's like, what the fuck? I was a polar bear. And we were like, that is so hysterical because that's all you do all the time is you sleep all the time still in this life. I have a book called Trainwrecks and Transcendence, which is a memoir of my time in this band, and that story I tell fully in that book. All right, let's see. What are some other questions about karma? No, reincarnation. Okay. What's the ultimate purpose? The ultimate purpose for reincarnation is to give the consciousness a chance to figure out what it isn't. So it's to give you a chance to figure out what it is, what you aren't, or what, and therefore what you are. Do spiritual practices make you less? Oh no, this is not on point. All right, so then I'll go to this question. Do you right away take birth in the next life? So, actually, look on my channel, my list of videos. There's a video on Magga Nakshatra. Magga Nakshatra, Magga, Bharani, they have to do with death and the whole process of death. Because Bharani belongs to Yama, who is like the Pluto, the overseer of the underworld. And then Magga belongs to Pitri, who are the deputies of Yama. So between Magga and Bharani, the Pitris and Yama, they take care of the whole mechanism of what happens between death and the next birth. So I talk about it in that video. And in short, no, you don't. First of all, time is only a mechanism for karma. Time is only a way for causes to produce effects, because the actual change from the cause to the effect is what you perceive as time. So time is just change. So when you don't always get subjected to time in the same way. And you can experience that in this life. Right, you can experience it right now. Like if you're very interested in this, then you probably wouldn't notice that already 40 minutes have gone by since we started. But if this was extremely boring and you had to do it because it was part of your whatever studies class, then you'd be like, oh God, this 50 minutes is dragging on so long. So time is very subjective to consciousness, because time is actually the rate at which you perceive changes. So if something is exciting, you perceive a lot of changes and the time goes by fast. If something is boring, nothing seems to change. Time slows down. So what happens at the point of death? This is actually quite good to explain in this topic. There's a soul, and then the soul manifests its tools in Prakriti. The tools are of two different types. Three, really. There's the first thing that Prakriti provides to the soul or to consciousness is a hook. A way for the consciousness to interact with its objects, the things that it's going to look at. A way for the observer to interact with the things that it's going to observe. That hook is called ahankar. It's the sense that I belong here. I can hook in here. And so that particular style of hook, that hook is a constant connection between the consciousness and the world. And it doesn't change ever. Throughout all your lifetimes, you're hooked into the material matrix with the same hook. Then that hook develops like a little spine called the mind and intellect. And some people call this a subtle body or astral body. This is like the subtle you, the non-physical you. This is the thing that is perceives, not doesn't perceive, but just like your eye registers, like your eye registers lights and your ears register sound, the subtle body registers ideas and feelings. The consciousness perceives the ideas and feelings, but the subtle body, which is the mind and the intellect, Mercury and the moon, it registers happiness, distress, varieties of those things like anxiety or anticipation, and stores memories and puts them together to make ideas. But the observer of those things is the consciousness. That thing changes, right? But it's more steady. As you go out from the root, the things get more and more changeable. So the hook between the root consciousness and your body is unchanging. Then you've got this mind and intellect complex, which changes but slowly. And then there's a body that is generated by the mind. Each thing is generating the next. So this is why mental state affects physical health and so forth. The mental condition generates a physical body. The physical body is changing like every day, all the time. And then what happens with death, what we identify as death, medically speaking, is where the physical body ceases to function. Physical body, of course, includes the nervous system, which is the most subtle part of the physical body. So where the physical body ceases to function, medical science identifies that as death. So what would happen at that point, it's like if your computer ceases to function, you give it up. That's called tyaktva. Dehantara prapti. Tyaktva dehantara prapti. Tyaktva, when you give it up at the end, when it stops working and you give it up. When you give up the physical body, what are you left with? You're not just this pure conscious thing. You're the conscious being hooked into a mind and intellect. But now the mind and intellect just has these hooks waiting to go into tools, new tools like eyes, ears, nose, mouth. So the hooks between the hook between the mind and the body is the connection between it and its tools, the senses, and that connection is forged by prana. That's why typically connected with death is the stoppage of breathing. And then the stop of the flow of blood by the heart stopping. Because the blood is carrying that prana, or oxygen, to the cells that can't directly breathe, right? So when the prana isn't in the body anymore, then the subtle body, which is the mind and intellect, can't connect to the physical body anymore. And the reason why it can't connect to it anymore, why does the prana withdraw? Because those senses have broken down. The body's become unusable, either by disease or by old age. So what happens then is you come out of the body. And what's the you that comes out of the body? It's this whole complex. It's like a tree that comes out of the ground and the roots are exposed. So there's these hooks that are supposed to fit into senses, but can't. They've been disconnected from their senses. So at that point, you're existing in like a dream state. Now you're perceiving things. Still you're perceiving things, you're still the perceiver. Just like when you fall asleep and shut down your senses almost entirely, you still perceive things like dreams. So similarly, when death occurs, you enter into a different kind of a world, which is not a physical world anymore. But it's a world that's similar to the world of dreams. It's a world that's on the mental platform. It's a world, it's like a ghost world or a dream world. And on that world, the Pitris, these class of supernatural beings called the Pitris, they come and ferry you to Yama. So the lords of Magha Nakshatra come and ferry you to the Lord of Bharani. They come and ferry you to Yama so that the system there of assessing your karma and your deeds can be carried out. So the assessment of your karma and your deeds from that particular incarnation happens by these pitris under the guidance of Yama. And then your next incarnation is decided. Yama is in charge of the mechanisms that decide your next destination. So this is where karma comes into play. It's like it's not just what you want to manifest, but it's also what you are allowed to manifest as a result of what you've done. So the amount of time that transpires in a dream is indistinguishable. It's non-distinct. Just like when you go to sleep, you're never quite sure when you wake up how long you've been asleep until you look at how bright it is or until you look at a clock. So similarly, when you die, the amount of time that passes becomes indistinct. You don't really know. Like even in the physical world, you see how there's a flexibility to time, to the experience of time. When you're dead, the flexibility of time is magnified by 100 million. So there's no sense like, oh my God, quick, where's my next birth? Time becomes quite irrelevant. Like an immense number of things can happen within 0 minutes. And also there can be no feeling of great delay within thousands of years. So anyway, there's some time that transpires while you are dead, while you're not manifesting a physical body, but it's rather irrelevant and it's impossible to measure, and it's not the same for everybody. Because what has to happen is Yama and the Pitris have to figure out, like astrologically speaking, they have to figure out where's the next. I bet you those guys are incredible astrologers. They have to figure out where's the next alignment that matches what this person needs to experience. And then we got to hold this person. It's like an incredible post office. We have to hold this person until that alignment is ready. So there's different places in Yama's court where you can be held and still experience results of karma, positive and negative, while you're waiting for another tangible birth. So it'll be like experiencing an incredibly great dream or an incredibly bad nightmare. So while you're waiting for the next tangible birth where you'll be making new karma, you can be getting heavenly rewards or hellish punishments in order to burn off or cash in your existing karma. But it's not really happening in a physical, tangible world. It's all happening like in dreams. But dreams are just as real when you're experiencing them. So eventually what happens at some unknown amount of time between when you die and when the next birth is, eventually what happens is the universe is in the right configuration, the stars and planets are in the right configuration, Yama releases you to go into a birth. Okay, so there's an unknown amount of time that happens between one death and the next birth. The only thing that you know for sure is that you can't be born before you've died. So like if somebody died in 1970, it's meaningless to say that they reincarnated in somebody who was born in 1960. But they could reincarnate in somebody that's born in 1970 the next month, or they could be reincarnated in somebody that was born in 2170. And I've heard it said, this is just conjecture, but I've heard it said that the more unusual the person's karma is, the longer the amount of time that there is between their incarnations, because the more rare the configurations are that are required to host that birth. Okay, so hopefully that answers that question. Do past, present, and future exist? You really wants to know. No, there's past and future are a theory. The present is what exists, but the past and the future are modifications of the present. So the past is simply a present that is not currently in your experience. The past and the future are both present states which are not currently in the present. The past is one that has already been experienced. The cause has, in other words, which means what? It means the cause has already produced an effect. Then that cause becomes the past. The future is where the cause is going to produce the effect, but the effect hasn't come yet. So that thing is the future. But the only place where consciousness exists is in now, in the present. But it doesn't mean that the past and the future are irrelevant, because the present is created by a cause. So the present is created by the past, and then it affects the future. So the future and the past are not non-existent, but they're never directly experienced. The only thing that you experience is the present, but the present is a result of the past, and it's a generator of the future. Because time is real. Time is real. Time is the thing that's allowing cause to become effect. Hopefully that explains that. How does the soul reach the upper level of consciousness if everything becomes nothing? Right. That's not the Vedic concept that everything becomes nothing. Krishna is just saying, even if you think everything becomes nothing, then you keep getting recycled. But the Vedic concept is a soul is a constant thing, and it's trying to learn what it is by manifesting all these different life forms. What's the explanation of what's the explanation of our natural urges and tendencies? So this is called samskar. So this is the way that you remember your past lives. The way that you remember anything is by an impression being pushed into your subtle body. Remember, there's the hook, and then the subtle body, and then the physical body. So everything that you experience out in the realm of objects pushes imprints into your mind, which is a very soft thing. And then those imprints persist. That's just like a computer disk stores things by magnets. The mental space that we have stores things by what they call an impression. So it's like it pushes an impression onto it, and then that impression persists for some time. And because of it persisting, it affects the way the mental energy flows. So what you have from a past life, you'll carry over the samskars. You may not carry over the details, because that's cluttering up, like the RAM, the random access memory, needs to process details. But essence of things is stored in much shorter, smaller bits, and it's stored in these impressions. And those impressions affect the way you think and feel right now. So the natural urges, tendencies that you have in this life are a direct result of the things that you've been engaging with in recent past lives. Can you get gender dysphoria related to past life complications? Certainly gender becomes complicated because you're not a certain gender. I mean, that's one of the things. Everybody thinks that they are whatever their body is. So, like, if you're Italian, you think you're Italian. If you're even, or the ideology that body adopts. If you're Christian, if you're a Hindu, blah, blah, you think you're that. If you're black, if you're white, you think you're that. If you're fat, if you're skinny, you think you're that. If you have long hair, short hair, you think you're that. If you're a man or you're a woman, that's what you think you are. But you're not. You've been everything. And so a lot of times it can be very complicated, because you may have karma to push you into. So it may explain some of the gender dysphoria that people experience, that they may have had a feminine previous life, but be, for example, in a male body in this life, but some scars from the feminine life may still be very strong, or vice versa. Some scars from a previous masculine life may be now present, but they may have a female body. That can explain some of it. They're past lives. Actually, they're not parallel lives, according to the Vedas. Because time is actually a linear thing. A cause produces an effect. Now, the linear thing can circulate around to become cyclic, and it does. That's what yugas are all about. And seasons and things like that, and day and night cycles. But even a circular process goes in a line. The circle spins in a certain way, clockwise or counterclockwise or something. Yeah, it's a gift not to remember your past lives, because if you did, it would screw up your whole thing. But if you want to screw up your whole thing, then it's very good to remember your past lives. Let's see if we've got any more questions here. Yeah, 3-year-old. Jill's mentioned something about a 3-year-old. Tell me about God. Somebody said, friend's 3-year-old said to the new baby, tell me about God. I'm starting to forget. So this is also very interesting because I've had 3 kids. And when they're super, super young, it's crazy. Sometimes it's just scary. The personality traits that they exhibit, which have nothing to do with the physical being that they are right now at that time. So it actually takes a while. You want to watch for that first month. The first month is the time that it takes the moon to go around the 12 zodiacs. So before the moon makes a complete circuit, the person hasn't even really connected their material, their mind to their current body at all. So within the first month of a child being existent, you can observe a lot of strange behavior in them. And people say it's gas and all that stuff, but you could see like a lot of weird expressions, weird sounds coming out of their mouth, and weird stuff like that. Here's a question. Is our last past life the most influential in this current one? Usually, but actually, you also have to remember that you think that you're a human being. Just like we go on, I just went on this little bit about how you think you're Italian, or you think you're Indian, or you think you're a man, or you think you're a woman. Actually, you think you're a human being. But you're not a human being. But there's a special thing about being born as a human being. A human being is one of the forms that you've manifested. You've also manifested yourself as a ladybug, as a tiger, as an elephant, as a single-celled amoeba, as a crystal. So, as a tree. So that's an important thing to realize. But the special thing about being a human being is that humans have a command of words, which is unparalleled by other species. They have a command of words, yet they are also superhumans. Also have a great command of words, like the gods and so forth. But the human beings are they have a command of words, but they're in a condition. Okay, they're in a condition where happiness and distress is both are existing side by side. But in beings that we modern people call animals or plants or things like that, when you manifest in forms like that, you don't actually generate new karma. Because karma is an action that you take, an action that you initiate, and which therefore sets a new chain of events in action. When you're not a human being, you're not actually initiating new actions, because you don't have the intellectual capacity to actually make that decision. Below the status of a human being, you're experiencing things. And the interesting thing is that also above the status of human being, you're also experiencing things. You have above the human being, you have a capacity to make decisions and set new karmas in motion. So there's some of it going on there. But mostly you're just experiencing really positive things in a superhuman life. But it's really the human form of life which is focused on learning. Because of the fact that we can use language, but it's the first time that you can use language in terms of the evolutionary in progress from bacterias up to gods. So this is a really important juncture, because you can learn things and you have great opportunities. more than the gods have, the human beings have more opportunities to make decisions. The gods have more just things come to them automatically, without effort. But the human being has an amazing amount of responsibility and opportunity. So actually the human form of life is very, very, very important. But this is a tangent on the question of if the last life is the most influential. So you may be coming up through an animal birth. You can go down into an animal birth and come back up to it, and those wouldn't be that influential. It would be actually your previous human birth would be the most important and influential. All right, I think we're going to shut down. People were pretty interested in this. All right. So thanks everybody. Yeah, this is a good one. Maybe we'll do more on this. I think maybe next week we'll do karma, and so that will be related to reincarnation. So we can keep talking with this. We're talking on this subject, and then in the one after that we would do Maya. What's Maya or illusion? And this thing does get recorded, so you can go back and watch it if you wanted, Valerie. And you could even make a transcript if you really. Okay, guys. All right. Sorry if I missed questions. I just tried to pick up whatever I could catch. Thanks, everybody. See you Friday for the Nakshatras session.